So partial is, think of it as you're going to have some veins are coming back normally, a couple of, multiple veins going back abnormally. So in the first scenario, this is called the scimitar syndrome. And they call it scimitar syndrome because it's sort of on X-ray and angiography, it looks sort of like a scimitar sword. That's where you have either one or two lobes of the lung. Usually it's the right lung. It's going to drain anomalously into the IVC area. And then you'll have probably normal left veins and maybe even one normal right vein coming to the left atrium. Often your atrial level shunt is going to be bidirectional. It can be either direction, so it doesn't have to be right to left in this case, because remember, we have a few normal veins here. So that's the scimitar syndrome. Our most common partial veins is going to be the kind where it's involved with a sinus venosus ASD. That's where you have a couple of pulmonary veins coming to the SVC area, and then you have normal veins on the left, and then you have your ASD here. So that's our most common. They kind of go together. So you can have a sinus venosus ASD with partial anomalous pulmonary venous return, or partial anomalous pulmonary venous return with a sinus venosus ASD. They sort of have high association with each other. So kind of think of them as the same kind of animal. You can also have some other variants where you can have, say, a couple left veins going into a vertical vein, into a nominate vein, and then down over to the right side. And you might have right veins that are normal. You can also have partial veins to the coronary sinus and so forth. So keep that in mind. They can be all sorts of different varieties. Highly associated with sinus venosus ASD and vice versa, about 85%. So if you have a kid with partial anomalous pulmonary venous return to the SVC, or if you have a sinus venosus ASD, you think they're almost always associated with each other. You can also have additional ASDs as well. So this is a cartoon view from the right side. We're looking at the different types. So in a partial anomalous pulmonary venous return with a sinus venosus ASD, there's a couple different types of sinus venosus ASDs. You can have a superior vena cava type, that's up here in the top. That's going to be associated with anomalous pulmonary veins. Usually it's the upper and the middle. You can also have an inferior type sinus venosus ASD associated with partial anomalous pulmonary venous return. So that's usually going to be maybe a lower or a middle, but there can be some variation with that. So there's no hard and fast rule. And then you can have additional ASDs as well. So that's something we see when we see partial anomalous pulmonary venous connection associated with a sinus venosus ASD. Same with the total anomalous pulmonary venous return. The evaluation is going to be the same. Where those pulmonary veins connect and drain, find the location and size of the ASD, look for any systemic venous abnormalities. You're going to check the right heart size, and then you expect diastolic septal flattening. You're not going to have so much of a pressure overload like you do in total anomalous pulmonary venous return. Excuse me. You're going to have more of a septal flattening during diastole because it's indicative of volume overload. Assessing the pulmonary veins is the same as we are with the previous example. Looking to make sure there's no turbulence and obstruction. That atrial level shunt is going to be left to right for sure, almost all the time. Maybe a little bit bidirectionality too, but it's mostly all left to right. And then of course, PA pressure is going to be critically important. A couple of examples: this kid has PAPVC with sinus venosus ASD, but it's a SVC type. It's up by the SVC, so it's this hole up here. This kid was a teenager that came to me. She was a track athlete. I remember probably 20 years ago. And, first thing at this time we were just scanning parasternally first. So put the probe on, and first thing I think of, it's probably an ASD, because you get this sort of elongation of the LV in a big right heart. There's diastolic flattening. It's not systolic flattening, but the right heart's pretty big. 4-chamber view, yeah, the right heart looks big, but you see flow coming in from the pulmonary vein, so it looks relatively like there's not much going on. The atrial septum at this point looked pretty intact. In most of these kids, you don't have elevation of PA pressures because they can handle this for quite a while. So the TR velocity is low, 2.5 meters per second. Of course, when you get down to the subcostal, this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So often if you don't see the defect itself, often what first jumps out at you is the SVC looks a little more prominent than usual. And then you see this little squirt of red here. At this point, I thought, well, maybe it's just a small ASD or a PFO. And, then you got to kind of keep working through your views. So imagine when there is a sinus venosus ASD, often the SVC essentially overrides the atrial septum. You see I have that cartoon drawn in. So that's one of the hallmarks that you see quite often in sinus venosus type ASDs is the orifice of the cava overrides the plane of the atrial septum. And so the defect is right up in here. And sometimes it's hard to appreciate unless your window's good. But in this particular kid, her right parasternal window was the best. This is the money shot. So we're in right parasternal mode here. So if you just throw our ASE cartoon here, that's how we're imaging the atrial septum here. You can kind of imagine that's the SVC. Here's the defect right here. Here's where the SVC sort of kind of overrides the atrial septal plane there, and you can see all that turbulent flow there. Now, some of that's flow from the atrial defect, and some of it's the SVC flow. They kind of merge together, and sometimes it can be hard to discriminate that. Of course, you always want to assume that there's partial anomalous pulmonary venous connections. So in this lower image, you can see here's a right upper and a right middle are connected into the kind of the base of the SVC. And then so it's a little tricky to appreciate, but see how you can barely see them. But that one definitely goes to the SVC, and this one ended up being into the base of the SVC as well. So that can be highly associated with this kind of defect. Of course, when you Doppler the ASD, it should be relatively normal velocity. It should have a normal wave pattern that you would expect for just a normal, regular left to right type ASD.